Hello. Since I first made this white supremacy video shortly after the Capitol riots, various news agencies have offered stories and explanations of white supremacy as an underlying factor in the QAnon conspiracy and in the attacks on the Capitol. So, since YouTube deleted part of my video with its bad quality SoundCloud background, I'm going to try to redo this more efficiently and without the musical accompaniment. What I hope to do is to define white supremacy and to show you some links between American history and various events that have taken place in American history and the white supremacy that we saw at the Capitol. So, first of all, one of the first tricks of white supremacy is that it's invisible and we don't think about it or learn about it unless we see the Ku Klux Klan or possibly Nazis. Well, one of the things that white supremacy does is it's a magic eraser, and it removes people of color from United States history. So, whereas many complaints come about in Black History Month regarding the painful and controversial and so-called chip on their shoulder kind of histories of slavery, American history doesn't talk about the contributions that African Americans and indigenous people made to our own War of Independence in 1776. Keep in mind that Crispus Attucks, one of the first people to die in the precipitating events, was Black and indigenous. And also keep in mind that about 25% of the soldiers who fought in that war were Native Americans or African Americans, in particular slaves fighting for their freedom and bringing to the table another definition of freedom in addition to what Thomas Jefferson wrote for us. In the 1800s, about 50 years later, many Black neighborhoods in New York City were attacked by white mobs because my children keep interrupting me. I apologize. Many Black neighborhoods in New York City were attacked because at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, artisans and skilled workers had to compete for jobs. So the first neighborhoods to suffer when jobs became difficult to procure were Black neighborhoods, and therefore free middle class neighborhoods in places like Philadelphia and New York City often were attacked in riots and burned to the ground. I don't need to rehash for you the obvious white supremacy of the time period in between 1830 and 1890. Obviously, slavery and the Civil War created multiple attacks on Black communities and an ongoing war against Black people, according to Frederick Douglass. However, in 1898, a middle class Black neighborhood in Wilmington, North Carolina, was attacked by white supremacists and burned to the ground. Numerous other cities, such as Rosewood in Florida, about which there is a famous movie, parts of Atlanta, and many other places where Black people had established thriving and independent communities, were burned to the ground and destroyed, starting in the 1800s. In 1917, a group of Black soldiers who were stationed in Houston became participants in one of the race riots that actually involved Black aggressors. So keep in mind that for the most part, I'm talking about instances where white people attack Black people because of their threats to the economic well-being of the perceived white nation or white community. 63 Black soldiers, 1 lawyer, 110 men found guilty, and 19 sentenced to death by hanging in a trial where the local military base comes into conflict with Houston's white citizens. Black soldiers who marched in uniform in after they participated in any number of U.S. wars, but particularly the World War I soldiers often suffered from attacks or were prevented from marching in the street in uniform, in large part because black men in military uniform embodied the ideal of civic masculinity that Anglo Americans wanted to procure and restrict for themselves. If you think about the boxer Jack Johnson, there we have another example where a black heavyweight champion of the world in an historical moment when boxing is the most important sport for asserting masculinity and supremacy. These are cases where black men appearing as boxers or as soldiers were attacked both in England and in the United States and prevented from marching in uniform, often denied their pensions, and very rarely decorated. In 1921, the Black Wall Street of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was attacked by a white mob that murdered numerous people and burned the section of Greenwood to the ground. So what we see here is a pattern of historical moments when white people in particular feel as though their way of life, their beliefs, and their privileges and rights as American citizens are coming into question or are disappearing, and they turn against the black community to blame the black community for denying them what they believed was their rightful possession. Here is another description of an attack in Fayetteville, Cape Fear, with the Wilmington riots, and the attack on and murder of many black people in that event. And here's a really short list of events that were perpetrated by white supremacists or by a system that refused to allow African Americans the same rights and freedoms as other Americans. So, white supremacy, in this definition, I will reiterate, is a response to perceived threats by perceived outsiders when white Americans, in particular, cannot hold on to or fear losing their so called way of life, privileges, and economic advantages. I don't want this to be too long, so I'm going to cut out here. Have a great day.